So much promise, such little return. Now, if you're a baby boomer, that's the post-World War II generation, and you're on your cruise, I suggest you don't watch this, because it could cause offence. Now, the thing about being young in the late 60s and early 70s was that there was potential. There was the feeling there was potential for change. And many of the reforms, over 250, which was legislated by the Whitlam-led Labor government, were as a direct consequence of that enthusiasm. The need for change. And we saw a flowering, sorry for the pun, but we saw a flowering of many movements. The dilemma was, at that particular period in time, whether you marched through the institutions, which meant you took up a position in the institutions and worked your way up and created reform through the institutional process, or whether you worked outside the institutions. Now, obviously, in a capitalist society, private investment for private profit, people need some type of income in order to survive and prosper. So a lot of the energy which was directed at reform-based change, both extra-parliamentary and parliamentary, was basically about redistribution of wealth and personal politics. They were the two fundamental elements within that movement. And a number of significant tactical errors were made, where a lot of people believed, a great majority, that increased personal freedom would somehow improve people's lives. And they believed that reform was possible by taking up institutional employment. And the heady days of the late 60s and early 70s were followed by a period where many, a significant majority of people took up institutional positions, thinking that somehow their participation in these institutional structures would lead to significant change, even reform. But what we saw with the dismissal of the Whitlam-led Labor government in 1975, we saw that involvement in institutional activity didn't lead to reform. In many regards, it led to an attitude that people developed of obeying the rules, not pushing the edge of the envelope, not putting their head above the parapet, because people forgot that institutional power, especially when that institutional power can be used to direct your life, can have a significant impact. So what we saw is people, the great majority, putting their heads down. A few were expelled. A number were not able to be employed in these institutional structures because of their political positions, the stands they'd taken. But in the great majority of cases, people put their heads down and worked up the right channels, forgetting that ultimately they were just a cog in a machine. And within a few years, we saw major changes in people's flirtation. The baby boomers' flirtation with a reformist and radical agenda. We saw them take up positions of power, both in the political processes, in institutions, in private bureaucracies, and mimic and magnify those inequalities. Neoliberalism, corporatisation, globalisation, deregulation and privatisation isn't some process which was introduced by conservative and reactionary governments. Many people in the Country Party were little more than agrarian socialists, and the Liberal Party, unlike today, had a large moderate reformist element within it. It was a broad church. So what we saw is the introduction of legislation and processes and changes which introduced these concepts into society by people who've been elected into office in the Hawke-Keating government, which promoted corporatisation and globalisation and deregulation and privatisation. And we saw these major changes occur because individuals, the baby boomers, our generation, believed that change was no longer possible, and the best way to survive was to work through the bureaucracy, to get promotions, to obtain wage increases, and to keep their mouth shut. And we saw more in legislation going through Parliament, which basically made public servants little more than mouthpieces for the government of the day, removing any ability of them to actually provide fearless advice to governments. At the same time, we saw the brightest, the more ambitious move from the public sector into the private sector, taking up managerial positions and using these managerial positions to promote ideas, changes, concepts which they had no affinity with initially in the 60s and 70s, believing there was no other way. And that's the key to the baby boomer generation. They were so inculcated with the ideas of those who managed and controlled them that they took on those ideas and, more importantly, expanded those ideas. So we saw changes occur in society which would have been unimaginable in the late 60s and early 70s. Obviously there were changes regarding personal politics and identity politics, but ultimately these changes were changes which were directed at a minority. And although there were many positive aspects to these changes, what happened is that the baby boomer generation, the great majority, not all of us, but the great majority, believed that the way forward was to accumulate as much wealth as possible and take up the very options that we didn't even think about 10, 20 years previously. where we saw changes in legislation which in many regards forced many baby boomers in stable jobs to take on investment portfolios. They become invested in the very system which was responsible for the growing inequalities in our society. The dilemma was the profit mantra that was such an important component of the 80s and 90s took no prisoners. And what I mean by that, everything was fair game. The environment was fair game. People on social security benefits were fair game. People involved in manual labour were fair game. The so-called traditional working class were fair game. And it was about changing the mindset and trajectory of people to embrace a new world where the creation of profit, irrespective of the human, social and environmental factors, became the predominant thing, the predominant aspect of everybody's life. And we saw this over and over and over again as we saw people in stable occupations leave trade unions in droves and continue to acquire profits irrespective of the consequences. Now obviously this creates a problem. It creates a problem we see over and over and over of the human race. Although some people had been able to entrench themselves in the bureaucracy and make hay from legislation which was designed to reward investors, and while a significant minority also saw their lives improve because of the success of identity politics, we saw an increasing number of people around the world, especially in the Western world, being denied access not only to power in so-called parliamentary democracies, but to wealth. And the reforms which the baby boomers not only supported but introduced began to have an impact on a growing number of people as they saw their future destroyed. Now these impact was not on the baby boomer generation, or a significant proportion of the baby boomer generation, because they were able to enjoy the fruits of the investment philosophy and legislation which placed the creation of profits above everything else. And we saw a significant number of people in jobs take on investment portfolios, and we saw a growth of this industry. But at the same time, we saw a significant number of people, especially younger generation, being frozen out of this equation. We saw it more difficult. People have found it more difficult, especially those without resources, to acquire an education. If they required an education, in many regards it was useless and it was expensive, because free tertiary education was no longer part of the society. We saw the public institutions in this country denied of funds. It's all very well to talk about waiting lists in public hospitals and people not able to access aged care packages, but the reality is these things occur in the richest sovereign nation state on the planet because of growing inequalities in the taxation system which rewards those with the most generous taxation revenue. So we see a decrease in taxation revenue. So what we see is not all baby boomers, but a significant percentage of baby boomers now have superannuation, significant amounts of superannuation, and they can plan their lives for the next decade or so. But the reality is their children and grandchildren have been left with a burning planet. They've been left with growing inequality. They've been left with a society where you have to work every day till you're elderly in order to pay for the most basic necessities. As a society where governments have to step in to assist people to acquire the most basic accommodation. We see extraordinary prices for accommodation. We see increasing legislation which restricts people's ability to express themselves, to talk about what they believe in. And so what we've seen, as we see in the rest of the world, as we see in the USA, is we see a growing authoritarian movement where people are looking for scapegoats for the situation they find themselves in. And I'm not talking about the baby boomers because they're enjoying their cruises. Not all baby boomers, obviously. Not everybody sold their soul for 30 pieces of silver, but a significant proportion did. And some didn't even realise they'd sold their soul for 30 pieces of silver. But the reality is, we've now created the baby boomers through accepting that there is no other way, that only a private investment for private profit creates the necessary infrastructure to keep everybody alive. We now find ourselves in a situation where authoritarian movements, with looking for simple solutions where they can blame the other for the situation they find themselves in, growing in popularity by an increasing number of people who know, not believe, but know they have been left behind, who know they have been sacrificed, who refuse to accept the reality that we have a climate emergency, who refuse to accept the reality that their issues are not issues which have been created by migration or somebody of a different religion or colour or sexual preference or gender identity. But by that small section of society that's continued to acquire wealth and power. Because ultimately, the type of society you have is determined by how wealth is distributed, not just created but distributed, and who exercise power. And over the last 40 to 50 years, through this so-called neoliberal age, what we've seen is, on the one hand, the creation of authoritarian political social movements which are fighting back, but which are repeating the mistakes of the past over and over again, and the refusal of people to understand their situation is totally due to growing inequalities in this country, structural inequalities which have been put in place not just through parliamentary legislation but through people accepting the norm that is no other way. And as the baby boomers disappear from the planet, what we'll see is increasing dislocation, increasing feuding, increasing instability, unless we all realise that our problems are not due to the efforts of the other people in our society that are not like us, but our situation is directly related to the growing power that a shrinking minority, through their manipulation of their wealth, is able to create. So I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest. Just go to their webpage, pipsi.net, and you can join online. If you want change, you need to make the effort. If you're happy with the situation, see you in hell.